My name is Keondra Bailey. I'm the Assistant Standards Program Manager at NISO. I work with all of our working groups and topic committees, and I organize them. I work with our Associate Executive Director, Nidhi Lagasse, to organize them, get them published, and all of that good stuff. You've probably heard a lot about standards. If you haven't, come see me afterwards, because right now I'm going to talk about recommended practices. But first, what is NISO? If you don't actually know what NISO is, we are a nonprofit industry trade association accredited by the American National Standards Institute, aka ANSI, with over 230 members. And we basically have members all over the information industry. That's libraries, library organizations, publishers, publisher organizations, vendors, suppliers, intermediaries, and many, many important other associates. We create not just standards, we also create recommended practices, technical reports, and white papers. Our work falls under 3 distinct topic committees: information creation and curation, information discovery, and interchange, and information policy and analysis. And I created these slides in Canva, which did not translate over to Microsoft PowerPoint very well. I don't think they like the competition. The last point actually says that NISO is volunteer driven. So we greatly value our volunteers, because without them, we wouldn't be able to do the very important work that we do. So a bit about recommended practices. The difference between recommended practices and standards, the 3 biggest ones are: recommended practices give you flexibility. They're meant to be fast moving and adaptable. They are future focused. They are very good for documenting processes around emerging technologies. Standards are much more fixed. They are better for documenting a process that there's a good community around, and recommended practices are great for developing a community around. And the difference between standards also is that recommended practices are just recommended. They are not meant to be prescriptive. They serve as a guide, so that also ties it. And this is just a quick visual about the different steps. So you can see with the recommended practice, there's a bit less that you have to do to get to the published phase, where it's with a standard. Due to our collaboration with ANSI, there's a lot more that goes into it. And some key points I wanted to talk about with recommended practices also is that there are key points in the development of a recommended practice that's very important. And first thing that happens is that people come to us, they have an idea, it's developed into a work item. That work item gets sent to a topic committee, it's reviewed, it's approved, and then it goes to our voting members. Then the working group is formed, and once that's formed, they develop work plan, determine scope, and then they create a draft. Now, the draft for public comment is where the fun comes in for everyone who's not involved, because they get to see the document. If they have knowledge of the topics surrounding the document, they can comment, and they can actually affect the document if those comments are determined to be substantive. CREC, which we're going to talk about, is here. So the final stage is publication, and the group transformed into a standing committee, and anything that needs to be revised gets reviewed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my quick bit, so I can get to the lovely presenters I have with me here today. Next up is Dr. Jodi Schneider to talk about retractions. And by the way, if you want to contact me, here I am.
All right, fantastic. Hopefully you can hear me, and hopefully you can see my slides.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your slides.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a bunch. All right. So I want to talk first about what retraction is, because that underlies why we're doing this work of developing a recommended practice. So retraction is a mechanism for correcting the literature and alerting readers when there are serious flaws in the literature that a correction notice is not sufficient to fix. And so these could be articles that have findings and conclusions that can't be relied on. And on the right, you see some retraction guidelines from the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is the editorial group that gives recommendations about publication ethics, including retraction. So about 1 in 1,000 articles is retracted. This is across all fields. We hear the most about it in medicine, but 60% of retraction is in engineering. Reasons for retraction include unethical research, redundant publication, issues with data, issues with results. And what I really want to stress is that the healthy ecosystem of research needs retraction. It's part of the process of correcting science. Sometimes we get it wrong. And honest error can and sometimes does lead to retraction. Items can be retracted over varying timeframes, days, sometimes weeks, months, years, decades. So there are items that have been retracted after 40 years. And the problem I've been focusing on is that even when results are wrong, people may cite and use retracted work. And that is really problematic. One reason I think that people are citing retracted work is it's very difficult to figure out that publications are retracted. So here you see 2 retracted articles from scientific reports. So same place, they look really different. On the left, you see retracted article : in the title. That's a really good flag. And you also see this little pink red, this article was retracted with a little yield sign, right? Very easy to spot. That's the first thing that draws my eye. On the right, nothing in the title. And we see these blue addendum. Oh, wait, a retraction to this article was published on 9th November 2012. Okay, so inconsistent notification styles are part of the problem. It's difficult to figure out that something is retracted just by, glancing at it. There's also a lot of disagreement in retraction indexing. So of course, not every item is covered in every data source. And so if we look here, the orange here is what's not covered, and the blue is what's indexed as retracted. We're looking at things that any one of these 4 sources are claimed was retracted, and looking at the consistency there. And it's this pink part that I'm really concerned about. It's this part that's saying, Crossref has some disagreement. Scopus has a significant amount of disagreement. Web of Science has disagreement. Why does Retraction Watch not have any disagreement? It only covers things that are retracted. So there's nothing in it that's covered but not indexed as retracted. And this is from April 2023 data. I hope this situation will be getting better, especially because Retraction Watch data has just become available. We can also see that when we look in databases, it can be very difficult to get to the retraction notice if you're using an open URL or you're using this kind of metadata-based linking. One of the problems that happens is that the author name is not necessarily the same. The retraction notice might be authored by many different possible groups, but the author of the article is not necessarily an author of the retraction notice. So that was what, in a case that I studied for a while, meant that when we tested 8 databases, we mostly got errors like this. When we looked at PubMed, we got an error like that. And out of all the 8 databases that we tested, only Embase worked and could get us to the retraction notice. That particular article, you see this retraction notice here. This is from the journal Chest. They retracted the article because it was an author falsified data. So it was published in 2005, retracted in October 2008. So that kind of 3-year time frame of being in the literature, that's quite common. But as I say, it could be shorter, could be longer. The problem with this article is it's been cited more after retraction than before. So this graph on the right is in blue, the citations in those about 3 years before it was retracted, right? You see 11 citations here, 11 citations here, 10 citations here. And then the year after it was retracted, 22 citations already. So very quickly, it accumulated a lot of citations. And when we looked at the actual sentences, what was actually citing, 96% inappropriately cited the retracted article. They did not seem to know that this article had been retracted. And of course, when the data was falsified, there's very little reason to cite this as actually for the science. Of course, I'm citing it as, I'm discussing the research. That's a different situation. But this kind of continued citation that's inappropriately citing the retracted article, it is not rare. We got a large data set, everything that was retracted in the biomedical literature that's indexed in PubMed as of August 2020, and we looked at all the open access publications that we could get our hands on from PubMed Central in XML format that could be parsed. So 13,000 of those were citations after retraction. And in that large data set as well, 94% inappropriately cited the retracted article. The authors of those articles were citing just as though these retracted articles were normal, just regularly published, peer-reviewed papers. So they said things like, a study in rabbits confirmed this treatment can achieve a faster wound healing rate. Cite retracted paper. Can't cite a retracted paper for that, right? To date, only one human study has demonstrated something. Cite retracted paper. Again, you can't cite the retracted paper for this, not as knowledge. So I worked for a year or two with a number of stakeholders throughout a whole bunch of scholarly publishing, librarians, funders, publishers, many different types of folks, came up with 4 recommendations. What could we do? RISR stands for Reducing the Inadvertent Spread of Retracted Science. It's a project that's been funded since 2020 from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So first we said, let's, we need to develop a systematic cross-industry approach to ensure the public availability of consistent, standardized, interoperable, timely information about retractions. We need to recommend a taxonomy of retraction categories and classifications and corresponding retraction metadata that could be adopted by all stakeholders. We need best practices for coordinating the retraction process to enable timely, fair, and unbiased outcomes. There's been some progress from universities and COPE and Relate and journals getting together, the CLUE report, for instance. And then something I hope that many of you are in a position to work on is to educate stakeholders about publication correction processes, including retraction, and all other sorts of pre and post-publication stewardship of the scholarly record. So we put out a report about this. We then did a summary. So that's published in Research Integrity and Peer Review, open access. Anybody can grab that from that website. And I also just in closing, for my part, when I'm Caitlin next, I want to say that I think one thing that's going to help enormously is better metadata. And I was so delighted in September when Crossref announced a 5-year partnership opening up Retraction Watch data, fantastic data, now usable for digital library projects and any kind of public stuff. You can go to their website and download all of the data, and they're putting it into programmatic tools. All right, so Caitlin, over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jodi. So my name is Caitlin Bakker. I'm the Discovery Technologies Librarian at the University of Regina, and I've also had the pleasure of co-chairing the NISO CREC working group for the past year and a half-ish or so. And CREC stands for Communication of Retractions, Removals, and Expressions of Concern. And so we are a fairly large group. We currently have 26 members, 7 former members, and together we represent about 30 different organizations. So we have expertise from libraries, from universities, researchers, and then many different folks in the publishing space performing different sorts of actions. And so together our goal is to address this question. Once a decision is made to retract, withdraw, or publish an expression of concern by an appropriately authorized organization, how do the scholarly communications ecosystem and other information consumers become aware of and share information about the status of the original object? So to kind of shorten that down a little bit, essentially what metadata standards, what workflows are going to help to facilitate the clear, timely communication of retraction-related information and really help to ensure that that scholarly record is effectively corrected. Now, rather than just jumping directly into what the recommended practices are, I just wanted to give a little bit of context about kind of how we got to where we are and some of the work that we did along the way. Now, I won't get into the whole history of the project, but what I really want to focus in on here was what I have labeled as phase 1, which is our information gathering phase. That's where we spent most of our time as a working group, really understanding what is happening in the current landscape. So to help facilitate this work, we broke into 2 subgroups. So we had our publisher subgroup, and then we had an aggregator end user subgroup. And the idea was to kind of present or represent both the data producer perspective and then also the data receiver perspective, and have some really in-depth conversations about what are the current workflows, what are the challenges, what are the pain points, where are people right now, where would they like to go. And so it was a really wonderful opportunity to kind of have that insight into what is actually happening in the moment. And a broad range of practices emerged, which is somewhat indicative of just having 30 different organizations tell you what they're doing, but also I think helps to maybe explain a little bit some of the inconsistencies and the challenges that Jodi was noting from that end user perspective about the way things are actually being presented. So from our publisher subgroup, we were asking questions like, well, what's happening to the PDF? What's happening to the HTML? So 60%, a little bit above, about 62% of the publishers in our subgroup noted that they left the PDF online, but they would watermark every page with the word retracted. So that was relatively standard practice as far as this space is concerned. But there were a lot of other strategies too. Some folks would add the retraction notice to the beginning of the PDF. Sometimes they would add it to the end of the PDF. Sometimes they would remove the PDF entirely. Sometimes they would replace the PDF with the retraction notice. Sometimes they would replace the abstract with the retraction notice. And sometimes publishers had different practices, even kind of within themselves. So one publisher noted that their practice would depend on where something was published. So if it was published in a supplement, there was one set of actions that would be taken on the PDF, but if it was published in a regular issue, there was a different set of actions that would be taken on the PDF. So a very complex space. And with the HTML, it actually became even a little bit more complex. So I do want to mention about a third of our publisher subgroup, I have them listed here as no practice reported. That doesn't mean they don't do anything. That just means there wasn't one practice that they were doing. So they couldn't really articulate, here's our course of action, because it might depend on the journal that they were working with, the society that they were working with. They might be working to standardize those practices. So it just wasn't really a tidy sort of thing that they could express neatly. But there were a lot of other activities that folks were engaging in. Most frequently, the HTML would remain untouched, but in other cases, the HTML would be suppressed entirely. Sometimes the metadata in the full text would be removed from XML feeds. The HTML might be marked as retracted. The retraction notice might be added. The HTML might be replaced by the retraction notice. So again, a lot of variety. And publishers also noted that in this case, it could depend on the stage of publication. So if something was EPUB ahead of print, the HTML might be suppressed entirely, whereas if it had been assigned an issue, they might leave the HTML untouched. So again, varieties kind of abounded in this work. So with so much variety on the publisher side, hardly surprising that there was variety on the aggregator side. So our aggregators were reporting that they were receiving metadata through multiple channels in multiple formats. Sometimes this would be the same channel that they would receive publication metadata in through generally, like their XML feed. Other times they would learn about retractions because it was in a spreadsheet that was attached to an email, or even it was in the body of the email itself. Somebody kind of wrote them a narrative to explain that something had been retracted. Where something was a little bit more formatted, there were still inconsistencies. People were using different fields in different ways, or using the same field in different ways. There might not be a lot of robust information, so things like who actually authored the retraction notice oftentimes wasn't present, and sometimes there just wasn't enough information in the metadata being received to really identify what was getting retracted. So really difficult to make those sorts of linkages and connections. And the terminology that was being used could also really just exacerbate some of this complexity. So if you have a great memory, you might remember that in our original charge, we were talking about withdrawing items. We quickly realized that withdrawal means 3 different things in our publisher subgroup alone. And sometimes they meant more than one thing to a single publisher. And so, that sort of variation in terminology can be really problematic. Even things that have pretty well-defined definitions, things like errata or corrigenda, were being used as synonymous with each other and with retraction notices, all of which poses challenges for an aggregator trying to think like, well, how do I act upon this? And then all of the aggregators also had their own workflows and their own processes and end products for how it is they actually go about displaying this information. So they also have an abundance of variety in what it is that they're producing and how they're communicating that. And one thing I want to emphasize with all of this is that, I'm talking about this huge variety that, these different workflows people have. Different workflows aren't the problem. Different workflows are probably pretty, they're to be expected when we're talking about different organizations performing complex functions. So the challenge isn't that people are doing things differently. The challenge is that the work products that are being produced aren't mutually intelligible. So, I might produce something, but then I hand it off to another organization. They don't know how to act upon that. They don't know what it is that I intend for them to do or what it is that I'm meaning by any of this. So we really just had a lack of understanding overall, which is where the recommended practice comes into play. So when I talk about the recommended practice, the first thing I want to do is just mention what we're not covering in the RP. So in the RP, we're not talking about why retraction happens. We're not talking about when you should retract something, when you should remove something, when an expression of concern should be issued. Jodi, on her slide earlier, showed you the COPE guidelines. They already have great guidance on a lot of these issues. And so we're really thinking more about how is it that we display this information? How does this get communicated once those decisions have been made? And I do want to note that we are thinking about version of record articles, but we're also thinking about other scholarly objects as well. So things like data sets, preprints, conference proceedings, other types of materials that may be impacted by a retraction, even if they are not necessarily the retracted article, or the retracted publication, rather. And part of the reason we want to do that is because we wanted to make sure that these were going to be as flexible and as broadly applicable as possible. So we didn't want to make this something that you had to be publishing scholarly research articles and only scholarly research articles for any of this guidance to be applicable to you. And we do offer some guidance on implementation and operationalization. And to that end, we did kind of structure our thinking about the metadata elements to be what we were calling the ideal state, so sort of like the perfect metadata record, and then what's the bare minimum that you need in order to perform those types of functions. And when I say those types of functions, I'll get into what some of the mechanisms are in a little bit, but hopefully that will become clear. So mechanisms. So we do offer mechanisms and responsibilities for metadata creation, distribution, receipt, and display. So when I'm talking about mechanisms here, really I'm thinking about the concrete actions that need to be performed. So things like modifying the metadata of the retracted publication so that it includes the word retracted in the title, creating bidirectional links between a retracted publication and a freely available retraction notice, and vice versa, so that they are discoverable and they are linked to each other. There is that connection. And then ensuring that the metadata be immediately apparent to a human reader, but also be accessible through things like APIs as well. And with responsibilities, I did just want to note that one of our appendices is a RISRSII matrix, which lays out who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed of various sorts of actions, to really try and articulate who is to be performing and what is expected of the different actors kind of working within this space. Now, we did define our metadata elements as either essential, essential if available, and recommended. So essential and essential if available are those that are kind of necessary to perform those actions. So necessary in order to create that bidirectional linkage, necessary in order to actually update the title, whereas recommended could either streamline that process and just really expedite things, or create a much fuller picture of the retraction. So for example, with our essential if available, so my favorite example of this is a DOI, because a DOI is an amazing thing. If you're trying to identify a digital object, a DOI is probably the best piece of metadata for that, but not all publishers mint DOIs. And so because we wanted this to be broadly applicable, we didn't want to make that an essential element, because then that could really hinder uptake. So instead, it's essential if available, because we really want people to include that piece. It would make things a lot easier, but we recognize that there are different workflows and different practices. With regards to recommended, so in terms of those things that can expedite, you can think of information like volume and issue number, for example, where it can be helpful in identifying what object you're talking about. And then to create a fuller picture, elements like who actually authored the retraction notice and what was the reason for retraction, which just really helped to create that more robust representation of the action that was undertaken. And I do just want to emphasize, so I'm talking about like we were defining metadata elements. So I want to emphasize that we're not creating new metadata elements here. We are not creating new schema. We really wanted to make this as low barrier as possible. So part of the recommended practices include how it is that you can use things like JATs and cross-ref metadata and still incorporate these practices. So we were not looking to kind of create more administrative overhead or kind of parallel workflows people would need to engage in, but instead think about what is it that people are already doing, how can we leverage the current activities, and really kind of serve to facilitate this communication process. So as I mentioned earlier, we do offer some implementation guidance for specific groups, so actors like publishers, journals, web vendors, full-text hosts, including repositories, as well as aggregators and library services platforms. And we try to address some of the complex scenarios that we kind of were coming up with in our information gathering, so things like that EPUB ahead of print issue, or what do you do when a journal has ceased publication? What do you do when a journal has been transferred to a different publisher? How do you address all of these sorts of things? Having said that, there are undoubtedly gaps. We did have 30 organizations represented, but 30 organizations in the grand scheme of how many organizations they are, hard to say there's a representative sample there. And so I would just really ask you all and encourage you to take a look at the draft itself. You can find it at niso.org/standards-committees/CREC, CREC, or you can Google NISO CREC and it'll be the first hit. So I'd really just encourage everybody to please take a look at that. The public comment period is open until December 2nd, and we really are looking forward to that feedback that we will be receiving from the community. But at this point, we just also wanted to offer some takeaways for folks of what you can do with these recommended practices. And so I wanted to start with some takeaways for my librarian colleagues. And I think one thing I would encourage all librarians to do is ask your vendors about this. Ask your vendors what their current practices are. Ask your vendors, are you aware of the NISO CREC RP? How do you plan to align with this? How regularly are you checking your data to make sure that you are actually providing quality metadata? And also second to that, tell your vendors when there are problems. When things aren't showing up the way that you think they should or the way your users expect that they should, being able to highlight to a vendor, here is a specific example of a case where my user is going to, they're going to PubMed and they're having one search experience, but they're going to your resource, whatever that resource may be, and they're not being alerted to this information. Why is that? Because when you give a vendor something more specific, not only do you make it a little bit more actionable, but you're also letting them know, like, hey, this matters to us. I'd also say look at your own discovery systems and how you can surface metadata about retracted publications. A lot of LSPs have some level of functionality built in so that you can surface that information and bring it to the fore for your users. And to me, that's also a component of educating your faculty and your students, making them aware of the fact that retracted publications, retractions, expressions of concern, removals, these are all objects in our scholarly communications ecosystem, and how can they maybe engage with them, and how can they critically appraise them. Also alerting these individuals to things like, for example, the fact that Zotero and EndNote both have relationships with Retraction Watch, which will now flag any retracted publications in libraries, letting them know what the crossmark symbol is and how that can help them make sure that they are looking at the most recent version of an item. And finally, thinking about how retractions may come into play in your core library services. So aside from things like your discovery layer, for example, if you have an institutional repository, if you host like an open journal system, if you have a systematic review service, how is it that maybe you are working to identify retractions in these different services, and what do you do once you've identified them? And then just some takeaways for vendors. So thinking about investigating your current holdings and practices. How many items in your current offerings, whether those are metadata only or full text items, are associated with a retracted publication or are a notice of retraction? How would a user know that information? If they perform a search and a retracted publication comes up, would they know it's retracted? Does the retraction notice also come up? What's the user experience that people are having? To that end, also looking at metadata workflows. Where's your metadata coming from, and where are you pushing that to? How often is that getting refreshed? As Jodi mentioned earlier, retractions can take a long time. How is it that when that new data comes in, that is being refreshed in the system? How is it that when you are correcting something, that is getting pushed out to partners? And then finally, looking at the NISO RP and considering what are the current practices, how can I align with those, and also how do my partners and others that I'm working with align with the RP, and how can we kind of work together to facilitate this more transparent and timely communication? So on that note, again, please read the draft and give feedback, but also we would very much welcome any questions that you may have.